the format of the session today is I'm going to give a presentation about the report, which is the purpose of the event, is the report that we're launching today, Going Round in Circles, which is all about how to develop a new approach to waste policy following Brexit. So I'll give a presentation for about 20 minutes, pause for a moment in between, and then after that I'll invite the other panellists to the stage, and they can sort of respond to the report, but also to the whole topic, which is really about thinking about waste policy in a post-Brexit environment, what that means, where do we go next. And so they'll just make some comments on that, and then we'll have a bit of panel discussion and Q&A as well. I should just say as well, at the end, people will need to be escorted out in small groups because of our lift capacity. So that will be slightly another practical challenge. So if anyone does need to leave in the meantime, just sort of make your way out, and one of my colleagues will show you down and out of the building, but you'll have to be escorted with a member of staff. But don't be embarrassed about it. Just, you've got to do what you've got to do, and that's absolutely fine. So and if anyone needs the facilities, they're also out that way, and talk to a colleague about that as well. Anyway, let's get underway. So so the event, the topic, this is all about waste policy. Quite a few months ago, I started talking to both FCC Environment and Pennon Group, who've both been involved in this. And I think this is a really interesting topic. I think, and nobody's really thinking about this, but there's a whole set of environmental policies that have been primarily driven by European legislation to date. And in a post-Brexit environment, we really need to think about where we're going with those areas of policy. I mean, this is all sort of DEFRA policy. DEFRA's got a huge amount of stuff to think through. And this one, in this particular case, waste policy, is highly driven by European policy. So Brexit really opens up lots of questions about what we do next. Questions like, where has European waste policy been successful? Where has it been less successful? Are the targets that have been put in place desirable? Are they achievable? How have external factors such as changes in commodity prices affected the achievement of those targets? And how have they altered the economics of recycling? And really, how should the UK respond to this? How should the UK proceed? How can we develop a waste policy, and more generally environmental policies, that are more suited to the UK context? That could be that we could decide that actually the European approach is absolutely fine. But I think going through this process, what it's told me more and more is that there are flaws in the European approach. Not the underlying intent at times, but it's more about the way that intention has been put into practice. So how can we develop an approach which works in the UK context now that we have competency in this area? Well, we'll have competency in this area. What I'm going to do, the presentation is in 3 parts. The first part is lots of data, just to kind of set the scene, which is there's a whole chapter of the report that goes through this kind of thing. So the current state of waste activity. And then I'll go through a kind of critique of European waste policies, and then finally some suggestions on what we might do instead. So waste policy is primarily derived from EU directives, Waste Framework Directive, the Landfill Directive, a whole set of directives about waste, the proposed Circular Economy Package, which sets targets for recycling in 2030, which is very much the subject of this report. There's a linkage between waste policy and energy policy, especially around energy from waste. And then there's a whole set of policies that are devolved, or the devolved administrations are doing a lot of their own things as well in terms of waste strategies, targets, policies. So it's quite a complex arena, but a lot of this comes from European policy. But let's go through some hard facts. The amount of waste we produce in total has gone down by 16%. You may not be able to see all the charts particularly well, but I'll try and summarise. A 6th reduction in waste since 2004. Although we're now sort of on the increase, and what's actually increasing is construction waste, and household waste, manufacturing waste, and services waste has all declined. We're becoming a more productive economy. So our total consumption of materials has reduced by 20% since 2000. And if you look at this in terms of the amount of materials we consume per unit of GDP, which is a nice metric for resource productivity, we're a very productive economy relative to the EU, and we're getting more productive over time. So we are a productive economy, and the amount of waste we produce is going down. In terms of municipal waste, including household and some other waste, that has gone down, not by that much. But actually, if you look at it in per capita terms, it's gone down quite a bit as population has grown and the waste has gone down slightly. But what's more striking about this is that we're doing very different things with this municipal waste. A lot of it used to go to landfill, roughly 80%, but now we have 44% recycling rate in England, and the energy from waste slice has also increased as well. We trade scrap materials. And we're a net exporter of scrap materials, 15 million tonnes worth £3 billion, mainly metals, is what we're exporting. That was in 2016, those figures. We do import a small amount, but the exports vastly exceed the imports. And another thing we export is what's known as refuse-derived fuel, so essentially fuel derived from black bag waste, which is exported and incinerated overseas. And the cost of this, we calculated it for the report, this has grown in recent years to 3 million tonnes a year of waste, which is exported mainly to continental Europe, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden. But we're spending £280 million a year sending waste overseas where it's incinerated, and the recipients sort of benefit from that in terms of the energy. You could also sort of describe this as a service that those countries are providing in taking that waste away. So it depends on how you look at it. But that's something that doesn't get a lot of airtime at all. And it's kind of symptomatic of the fact that we don't have enough energy from waste capacity in this country. The environmental impact associated with waste has gone down substantially. So greenhouse gas emissions from the waste sector have gone down by roughly 3/4 since 1990, by far and away the most successful sector actually in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. And I looked at some of the data around other emissions. So emissions of dioxins and certain heavy metals have gone down by 99% since 1990. And one factoid in the report is that the dioxin emissions from incinerators are half the dioxin emissions from crematoriums. So if you really want, lots of people get very excited about dioxin emissions from incinerators, but the reality is that they're very, very low. And if you really want to talk about dioxin emissions, you should be looking at some of the other things like the open burning of waste, which happens in people's gardens and things like that, which produce far more dioxins. So anyway, in general, the environmental impact is much less. So that's kind of a baseline. That's what's been going on. And I suppose what you can take from that is the policy environment we have around waste has resulted in a material change in the amount of resources we consume, the amount of waste we produce, and what we do with that waste. That has brought about some substantial changes already. But this next section kind of gives a critique of where, that's a very positive story in a sense. But there are still issues, which is what I pick up here and in the report. So if you look at European waste policies and actually sit down and read them. One day I sat down and read the Waste Framework Directive, followed by the Circular Economy Package. That was a fun day. And what you discover is that these things are very, very unclear about what they're trying to do. In particular, so there's a bit of a story that's gone on here, as I understand it, sort of looking back at the waste industry and what's gone on. In the early days, in the 1970s and 1980s, it was very clear there was a lot of really bad stuff going on, particularly around hazardous waste, leachate from landfill sites, all sorts of bad things going on concerning waste. But those problems have basically been sorted now. The greenhouse gas emissions are going down, the dioxin emissions are going down. So it is worth asking the question, what is this waste policy trying to achieve going forward? There's really, that's where we should start from, essentially. But that is not where the Circular Economy Package starts from. The Circular Economy Package basically says we should recycle more because that would be good. And tries to sort of justify, it's almost a quite circular economy package. The justification for it sort of goes round and round. It prescribes the method of waste treatment, more recycling, but it doesn't actually say why. It doesn't actually give a cogent explanation of why that would be better than doing something else. So it's not very clear what the outcomes are that are being targeted. And it continues, in line with the Waste Framework Directive, continues to use weight-based recycling targets. There are a number of problems with those in that they encourage the collection of heavier materials, encourage a focus on quantity, not quality. They may actually be in conflict with waste prevention, because if you do something to prevent waste, it doesn't actually count towards your recycling target. And they do odd things, like why do we have such a focus on household and municipal waste when it's only 11% of all waste? There are targets for construction and demolition waste as well, but why don't we just look at waste in general? And if we are going to set targets for that. There's a lot of muddled thinking about what this is all trying to do. So kind of compounding that is the fact that the targets are really badly designed and don't actually reflect the UK context very well at all. So this chart is taken from the European Commission's own cost-benefit analysis, and what it shows, you won't be able to read the numbers, what it shows is the direct cost-benefit, which is the blue, to business, and the orange is the environmental cost-benefit, essentially. And a series of different options, these 7 different bars are 7 different sets of targets that the Commission considered. And what you'll see is the European Commission's preferred package is actually not the best one. They ignored their own analysis that showed that there was a better set of targets. And specifically what they've decided to do in the preferred option, option 3.8c, is really limit landfilling. And there is no environmental or economic justification for doing that. In fact, their own analysis shows that it's a bad idea. But that was kind of overridden. If you look at the same results for the UK, which is over here, what you'll see is that the preferred package, this option 3.8c, actually involves a 2 billion cost to business in the UK. And it's one of the worst. Of the options considered, it is, I think, the worst one. And they could have, if they'd chosen the best one for the EU, that also would have been the best one for the UK. They've just totally ignored the analysis, their own analysis, and done something that's not in the UK's interest. So we need to do something that suits the UK's context and is based on evidence. It's hard to argue with that, really. One of the other things that connects to this is a lot of what the Commission is doing is about boosting recycling, but that really ignores the fundamentals of what's been going on with the recycling markets, which I talked to a lot of the waste companies, and this is what's kind of hurting them right now. Commodity prices have fallen substantially since 2008. Not just oil and gas, but lots of other commodity prices, metals and so on, have all reduced in price by varying amounts. But that's also reduced the value of secondary materials. And that's undermined the viability of recycling as an activity, and certain recycling firms have gone to the wall as a result of this, smaller firms generally. So that's the fundamental economic context here, is that recycling has become less viable than it was. Not for all materials. For some materials it's still perfectly fine, but for some materials it's got much more difficult. I think we have a few more guests. Hang on 2 seconds. Would you like to come in? Yeah. No, come in. That's fine. Finally, there's a real issue around data and definitions in this whole space. I'm actually quite shocked how bad the data is on waste. There's reasonably good data about household waste and municipal waste, but data on virtually all other sorts of waste is actually really quite poor. So commercial and industrial waste, there's just very, very little information. We literally scoured around and tried to find some information for the report, and there's very little to say. There's very little data. So I don't really understand how you can manage this stuff if you don't know what's going on. What makes that even worse is the definitions are all quite muddled. There's differences in definitions between member states. There's even differences in definitions between the different parts of the UK, the devolved administrations, the local authorities. So, it's very, very difficult for policymakers to operate in this environment where they simply don't know what is going on. So that's another problem which really needs to be sorted out. So those are sort of the issues. There's lots of, as I say, there's lots of good things that have come out of the European waste policies. There's also some issues. So what we tried to do in the report was say, well, what should we be doing as the UK? Let's just kind of start from first principles. What should this all be about? What are the alternatives to the set of policies we have at the moment? So the first thing in my mind is to clarify the objectives. What should waste policy actually be about? And in the report, we point to 3 possible objectives. I mean, I'm not wedded to these, but it seems broadly sensible to me to try and think about sustainable resource use and waste management. And you can think about the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, environment, and social. That's the way I've looked at it. On the economic side, I think we should frame this around resource productivity. How can we increase resource productivity? The industrial strategy talks about this. How can businesses be more productive in their use of resources, use less resource in the first place, and get more value out of any waste they produce? That's about their bottom line, reducing their bottom, improving their bottom line. So that links to the industrial strategy and links to, narratives around productivity and competitiveness. The second is the environment. So let's be much clearer about what we're trying to do in environmental terms here. Is it about greenhouse gas emissions? Is it about air pollution? Is it about water? I don't know, but we should be much clearer about that. We should link it to the emissions reduction plan. We should link it to the DEFRA 25-year plan for the environment, because those are the other tools. If we're doing something on that, it's because it links to those things. And finally, on the social side, we should try and minimize the cost of all of this to society. And local authorities are under immense pressure in terms of budgets, and they spend a huge amount of money on waste management. So the extent to which we can minimize that cost is a good idea. It will help them balance their budgets more generally. We need to be much clearer about what we're trying to do with this particular set of policies. Linked to that, I mentioned all the stuff about greenhouse gas emissions. There's a very interesting analysis that can be done about what you achieve by doing different things with different types of waste. I think we need to be building some sort of carbon analysis into the way that we think about waste, some sort of carbon metric as a tool for decision making. This table here is something that came out of some analysis done for the Scottish Government. And what it shows you is, for each different type of waste, depending on what you do with it, you can either have positive greenhouse gas emissions or you can avoid some greenhouse gas emissions. And it gives you a sense of the scale of those savings. So what it tells you actually is that waste prevention and reuse is by far the best thing to do. It's much better than recycling, it's much better than energy from waste, it's much better than landfilling. It also tells you which materials have produce greenhouse gas emissions if they end up in landfill. So particularly the more sort of biogenic types of waste are essentially what you really don't want to end up in landfill, because that produces methane and so on. So you can actually use this analysis to drive decision making. This sort of approach is actually in place for London boroughs already. This is what they do, and they report it at London level. This is part of the Mayor of London's waste strategy. So it can be done. It's quite a useful way to think about this, and I think this sort of approach could be rolled out. Could be rolled out nationally. It should be rolled out nationally. It's just a much better way to think about and quantify what you're doing and why. So that's the second thing. Refresh the waste hierarchy. The rest of the presentation just gives a few other ideas of how to implement this overall approach about how the clear objectives and the carbon accounting, what that actually means. So in broad terms, we need to massively increase the focus on waste prevention and reuse, as I said. One of the really interesting things about this is some of the language we use. So we have a whole set of sites around the country called household waste recycling centres. Okay? People take their waste there and they either dispose of it or they recycle it. There's very little provision. There is some provision, but very little provision for reuse to take place on those sites. Part of the reason for that is it's slightly unclear whether it's even legal to do that. So this comes back to the fact that the EU's definition of waste is anything which somebody disposes of or intends to dispose of. So the moment they drive onto a household waste site with some waste or some stuff in their boot, it becomes waste, and that means that only a licensed waste operator can handle that material. So it's difficult for a waste company to simply sort of give reusable stuff to a charity, for example. That's really quite difficult. And even if they did, one of the interesting things is that wouldn't show up in the KPIs they report back to the council, which are all about recycling. So there's a sort of a huge focus on recycling almost instead of reuse at times, which seems very odd because I just showed you a slide that said that reuse was much better than recycling. So there's a huge potential, I think, to increase the amount of reuse we do and reuse usable items on, and that can be about giving them to charity, it can be about free cycle, it can be about improving provision on household waste sites. An example we give in the report is the Isle of Man, where they're not bound by any of these rules because they're not in the EU. Next to every civic amenity site, there is a massive warehouse. People can take stuff in there that's reusable. People can also take stuff from there at no cost. So essentially that is simply about reusing things, keeping them in circulation for longer. That is probably illegal to do that in the UK, or at least a bit of a fuzzy area. So some companies are kind of getting around this to an extent, but it's really quite difficult. So that's one idea. Recycling. I mean, the thing about recycling, particularly household recycling, is we just need to make this a lot simpler. It's very, very complex and confusing for households about what they're supposed to do with their waste and their recycling. It's estimated that there are literally hundreds of different recycling systems around the country. Even at times in neighbouring authorities, you'll have different materials being collected in different boxes by different people. So it all gets very, very confusing. There's some analysis that was done by Viridor, actually, that quantified how confused people are in terms of people putting out stuff that they shouldn't and also not putting out things that they should. It's just all over the place. So we need to simplify collection systems. There's the idea, the RAP's idea of a consistency framework, which I think is a very good idea. We just need to get on and do it. We should set a deadline by which that is implemented. Once you've done that, you can get everybody at other points in the supply chain to engage with people on that. So packaging should no longer say widely recycled on it. It should just say recyclable. If you knew what was recyclable everywhere, you could start to have much clearer language about what is and isn't recyclable. You could have much more proactive engagement by local authorities as well about recycling, also about reuse. Using things like behavioural insights. So, for example, you could write to everybody in a local authority and say, well, actually, you're doing okay, but neighbouring authority over there is doing much better, and they're actually saving money on their council tax as a result. That could be quite powerful in motivating people to do something different. There's also this interesting issue around the end of waste panel. So at the moment, if you want to get something certified as end of waste, is very difficult. There used to be an Environment Agency panel that could certify that something was no longer waste and therefore you weren't bound by waste rules. That panel has been closed at the moment, and even before it was closed it was a kind of significant bureaucracy. So it's actually very difficult for innovative companies who want to have a new process that takes things out of the waste stream and turns them into new products. It's actually difficult for those companies to go forward at the moment because of this bureaucracy or lack of a route for them to do that legitimately, and the risk that creates for their business. So that's another thing that just simply needs to be sorted out. And finally, I'll talk very quickly about energy recovery. So the government's principle on this is to maximise energy recovery from residual waste. So not that energy from waste should be done instead of recycling, but if you accept that there's going to be some residual waste, you may as well try and get as much energy out of it as you can. So as I said, at the moment we're exporting some waste to the continent, which we don't get any value from that. In fact, we're paying for that as a service. But we also, of the energy from waste facilities we have in this country, we actually have some very, very low efficiency energy from waste facilities, so sort of 10 to 20% efficiency in terms of the calorific value that goes in and the energy that comes out. They're very inefficient energy from waste facilities, some of them. There are better, more efficient technologies, so for example, gasification, grid gas injection, so turning black bag waste into gas that can be put into the grid or used for transportation fuel, or just simply adding heat capture to incinerators. That also massively increases the efficiency. But I think in this space, there's a need to try and improve the community buy-in. Incineration has been a very dirty word for a very, very long time, and it's often been difficult to get any energy from waste facilities built as a result. But the reason for that is there's no transparency about what the actual emissions are. On my earlier slide, I showed you that the dioxin emissions have massively reduced. That's not a widely understood fact. So people sort of are still very resistant to energy from waste facilities being built, and part of the reason is just a failure to understand what the process actually looks like. I found very little data on the internet about what the actual emissions from energy from waste facilities are. And finally, we could think about community benefit schemes for energy from waste facilities. So CETA, Suez did an interesting piece of work, but they actually tested with people in focus groups, how up for having an energy from a waste facility are you? Well, what if there's some benefit for your community, such as it funding local facilities or giving you money off your council tax bill or that kind of thing? And it massively changes the conversation because people can see that rather than it just being a cost to them in terms of environmental impact, the community benefits from it in some way. So it's worth thinking about that. It's an approach that happens in energy, in onshore wind, in nuclear, for example, but in waste it doesn't really happen. So that could be looked at as well. So basically, all of this stuff is in the report. The report goes through why it sort of takes you on a journey through why we should be thinking about all these changes to policy, what's wrong with the current set of policies, and then gives this kind of high-level reframing of where I think we should be going, and then some fairly detailed, specific things that I would change to sort of fit in line with that overall framework. So that's the report as it is.